to get into the mind of the man himself. So it's not a commentary. It won't be a commentary and it won't be an introduction. It'll be an attempt to understand Luke and his times and why he wrote what he wrote. What were his big themes and why did he choose to write on those things and not on other things? So that's basically what I've been doing. So I thought I'd share a bit of that with you this morning. I don't know how far we'll get, but we'll do what we can. Okay, finding Luke in his writings, and I believe I have to point that way. Still not working, hang on. Which one? The side one. Yeah, okay, it works. Just have to turn it upside down. All right, let's begin with what the hostile scholars say. If you haven't discovered it already, you soon will, that many scholars who write on Luke and Acts, well, I call them hostile scholars, they're not believers. And often their underlying motivation is to discredit Christianity, to take away the foundations from Christianity. So you need to be very, very careful of that. So some of the things which the hostile scholars say, well, they say that Luke didn't write Acts or Luke. It was written by somebody else and we don't know who it was written by. Well, even if he did, he wrote many years later, maybe in the 80s or perhaps the 90s, and some scholars in America are saying well into the 2nd century. So Acts particularly is separated from the events by quite a long period. That's what they're saying. And I would say that's the majority of scholars would put Luke and Acts at least in AD 80. Now you know that Paul was in prison in Rome, that's where Acts ends. So Acts ends at about 62. So they're saying that the book of Acts was written 20 years later, or maybe more. And that affects the way in which we kind of assess the historical value of it. Also, they say that Luke was not a companion of Paul. He was an admirer of Paul from the next generation, or even the generation after that. And so the account of the journey and the shipwreck, well, some of them say it's obviously drawn from a diary, but not from Luke himself. It's been incorporated. There's a lot of American writers at the moment who are treating Acts as a novel, as a fictitious novel. So, you know, you put the story of the shipwreck in to give it a bit of excitement. That's basically what they're saying. And so, well, they're saying that the Acts story is not true. Well, let me try it upside down. No, it didn't work. Maybe I'll do it twice. Higher. Higher.
It's moving on my screen. I don't know why it's not moving there.
Sorry?
It's moving here.
Well, maybe I'll walk up here. All right. So, what does it matter? What does it matter? Well, Acts is our only account of the beginnings of apostolic Christianity. Obviously, the beginning of Christianity is with Jesus, or even back into the Old Testament, but things change very much with the early church. And Acts is our only account of how things began. So if we lose that, we really lose our foundation document. And then Luke's Gospel contains a lot that is not in the other Gospels, like the angel's announcement of John and Jesus' birth, the birth of John the Baptist, mission of the 72, the parable of the Good Samaritan, parable of the prodigal son, the thief on the cross, today you will be with me in paradise. These are things that we would not know if we didn't have Luke, and there are many other things like that. So we'd lose a lot if we lost the Gospel of Luke. It's a bit sobering to realise that roughly 1/3 of the New Testament is written by Luke. Luke was the only non-Jewish writer. And in that sense, we owe him a great deal. And then, of course, there's Luke's own unique message as Bible-believing Christians, as people who believe that the Bible is the Word of God, that what the Bible says is what God says. Well, what Luke says is what God says. And Luke's own distinctive message, which is different to Matthew's message and different to Mark's message, different to John, we'd have lost that. So pretty serious if somebody sort of pulls Luke and Acts away from us. It's worse every time. How did that happen? What do I do now? Maybe I can signal to you to do that.
Try it out.
Change it. Try it, did you say?
There we go.
All right, so the questions we have to answer. Did Luke write Luke and Acts? Is Luke the beloved physician of Colossians 4:14? When did Luke write Acts? Was he with Paul for the voyage and the shipwreck? Did he write true history? Those are the sort of fundamental questions that I'm trying to work on. Yes, good. So the first of these, did Luke write Luke and Acts? Just very briefly here, because most books you read, most commentaries will tell you that the Gospels are anonymous. All the Gospels are anonymous. None of them, if you read in the Gospel, the body of the Gospel, you won't find the name of the author. And then they look at the titles on the Gospels that we have today, which is Gospel according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John. They say, well, they're not the original titles. They were put on in the 2nd century. So we don't know the original titles. Therefore, we don't know who the author is. Well, there's a bit of false logic involved in all that. Just because the Gospels were given similar titles in the 2nd century doesn't mean they didn't have a title in the 1st century. And lots of scholars have pointed out that books in the 1st century had titles. They had their author's name. It wasn't in the book. If you read the book, you read any book today, you won't find the author's name in the book. You'll find it on the cover or at the beginning of the book. And in the ancient world, because these things originally would have been scrolls, and the author's name was written on the outside of the scroll. So it's not inside, it's on the outside, or sometimes it was attached to the end of the scroll on a little tag. But it's very, very unusual for a book in the 1st century not to have the author's name and the title on it somewhere. Because if it didn't, you didn't know what to do with it. There were big libraries back then. There was a library in Alexandria with over 1 million books in it. And every ship that came into the harbour in Alexandria, the boss of the library was allowed by law to go on board the ship and to seize any books that he didn't have in the library and to get them copied and then give the original back to the people. So that library got everything. So you'd be pretty sure that, by, let's say by 70 AD, the 4 Gospels were probably in that library. And what did the librarian do with them? Well, he had to catalogue them some way, and he catalogued them by the author's name. So it's just untrue to say that the Gospels didn't have the author's name on them. Now, there's another thing there, and that is what I'm calling the importance of Theophilus. I've been thinking a lot about him. because you see, the book was dedicated to him, and it would have been couriered to him in some way. Now, when he got it, what did he think he was getting? Did he know it was coming? It's quite possible. When you dedicated your book to some important person in the ancient world, well, normally that person was expected to make copies and make the book known. And if Theophilus was a Christian, which I'm sure he was, Luke wouldn't have entrusted his manuscript to a non-Christian. The first thing that Theophilus would have done with this book is he would have called all his friends, Christian from the church, and also his non-Christian friends. He would have called them all together into his home. He's an important dude. He's got plenty of money. He's got a big home. And all this big group of people, and there would be a public reading. The whole book would be read. I mean, people did that in those days for entertainment before there was television and radio and stuff like that. Now, of course, Theophilus knew where the book came from. He knew who wrote it, and he knew whether or not it was true. He would have known whether Paul was on that journey to Rome and involved in that shipwreck at the end. And if he looked at the book of Acts and read this and realised that this was make-up, he's not going to be happy to have his name attached to something that was easily found out to be a fraud. So what I'm thinking is that Theophilus is one of our guarantees to the authenticity of Luke, the historicity of Luke, and also to Luke being the author. In fact, I've begun to think that it's possible that Theophilus might have commissioned the work. He might have actually said to Luke, look, you write this and I'll look after it from then on. Anyway, that's just a possibility. Very important in relation to this is the meaning of the we in Acts. The first person, you know what I mean? I or we, including me. We if there's a number of us, but I if it's just me. The first person, when you find the first person in a narrative, then it has only one meaning. It means that the author is claiming that he was there. We set sail from Troas. That means we, me, Luke, I was there too. Now, we talk a lot about, in theological circles, about critical scholarship. Well, critical scholarship is looking carefully at what you're reading and seeing things maybe that other people don't see. Well, I would think that the first rule of criticism is that if somebody says I or we in a narrative, it means they were there, or they're claiming to be there. They may be faking it, they may be pretending that they were there and they weren't, but at least they're saying they were there, whether it's true or it's false. So Luke joined Paul's party at Troas. That's where he starts talking about we. And he was with them in Philippi for that, when they went to Lydia's down by the riverside. They stayed in Lydia's home. Paul healed the demon-possessed girl, the fortune teller. They were locked up in the jail and all of that. Well, Luke was there in town when all that was going on, but when Paul and his party left Philippi, Luke didn't go with them. Luke stayed behind, and in fact, we don't find we again in the narrative of Acts until 4 years later, when Paul arrives back in Philippi and then goes across to Troas again, and now Luke is with them again, and he's with Paul all the way to Jerusalem. And then 2 years later, when Paul is put on a ship and sent to Rome for a trial before the emperor, Luke goes with him. So he's there until the end of the story. So it's interesting, I think, that Luke was with Paul during that voyage, and he had the experience of the shipwreck, And it's interesting that that account, the voyage and the shipwreck, is the best account, the most detailed account of an ancient of a voyage and a shipwreck in ancient history. There's nothing else to match it. And of course there are, a shipwreck's a pretty exciting thing to be involved in, and there were lots of them in those days. Sailing on the Mediterranean wasn't all that safe, particularly in winter, and Paul got caught up in that because winter started when they were still on their journey. So there are accounts, but there's nothing as detailed and as careful and as good as this one of St. Luke. Let me go back. Go back on that. Where are we? Jeez, this is quite unstable. Before I leave that, I'll just say a couple of things about this journey. It gives us a bit of an insight, I think, into the sort of person that Luke was. Now, you don't find Luke in that story. He says at the beginning, we set sail and they set sail together. So he's there. But for the rest of the journey, you don't see him. I think he's like when you see a documentary on television, the man behind the camera, who you never see, and you forget that he's there. You think that what you're looking at is kind of actually going on, and you forget that there's somebody behind the camera sort of looking at it all. Luke's a bit like that, and I think it tells us that he was a very humble man. I mean, if you were writing up the story, you'd surely say something about your own feelings or draw attention to your own presence in some way, but Luke never does that. He's always in the background. He's always behind the camera. His subject is Paul. It's Paul he's looking at. Paul he's admiring. He's wanting to tell us Paul's story, not his story. Well, I think that tells us a lot about the man. Something else about the voyage. Again, the hostile scholars will say, well, I've certainly read one that says, jokingly, it says, well, if Luke had a manuscript of the gospel that he'd written while he was in Palestine, and now he's working on the book of Acts, so he's no doubt got some manuscripts there. What happened to them when they went overboard and had to swim to the shore in Malta? Surely they all would have been lost and destroyed. And I remember reading that and thinking, yeah, that's right. Gee, that's a problem for us conservative Christians. And I kind of regarded that as a problem that I didn't know the answer to until my brother asked me to sail with him from the east coast of Australia to an island about 300 or 400 miles off 400 kilometres off the coast. It took us 3 days to get there, but when I got on and I'm not used to sailing on a little yacht, this was all new to me. When I got on there, he handed me this bag and he said, "This is your dry bag." And it was a suede leather bag, and it was about that size, and it had two plastic, he called them stiffeners at the top when you put it together and you rolled it up. Then he said it's completely waterproof. He says if we go overboard, he says your dry bag, that's where you keep your cell phone, that's where you keep your passport and your wallet and that sort of stuff. And he says you can even use it as a flotation device. And it's so simple. And I thought, gee, that's something you could make with leather and a couple of bits of bamboo. Surely they must have had something like that in the ancient world. And I'm sure they did because, in the Roman Empire, they were couriering. There was a newspaper that was published every week in Rome, and it was sent all over the Roman Empire. So people were travelling on ships, they had these kind of things. So that wasn't really a problem. Luke would have had a dry bag. That would have been the answer to that problem. But there's another issue. I was talking about these things at a conference in Perth, and a lady came up to me afterwards and she said, because one of the interesting things is the amount of detail in that voyage. I mean, every place they went to, and which wind was blowing, and which way the harbour looks. Does it look north or south or east or west? And Luke's got all that sort of detail in there. And you think, sure, how did he remember all this? That's what the question in my mind. How did he remember all this? Well, did he keep a notebook, or what happened to the notebook when they went overboard? Well, this woman came up to me, and she'd just finished a PhD on Jerome, but she said, it was fashionable in the first century amongst the Romans to keep a diary and to write down everything that happened that was interesting. And she pointed out one example to me. There was a chap we call Pliny the Elder, because there's two Plinys, there's Pliny the Elder and Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Elder, he was an aristocratic Roman, and he was the admiral of a fleet of galleys that worked on the Mediterranean. And he used to write down everything he saw. He'd have scribes helping him, of course. He wrote the world's first encyclopedia, and we have some of that. We don't have it all, but we've got some of the books of his encyclopedia today. So this woman said to me, that Pliny the Elder was on a galley out on the Mediterranean when Mount Vesuvius exploded. That was in 72, somewhere around about that year. And he was fascinated by this, the volcano, and he ordered the captain of the galley to get in closer. He wanted to get a better look. And we know about this because his nephew, who was Pliny the Younger, wrote to Tacitus, the historian we know about, wrote to him telling him an account of the whole thing. And he said all the way they were going in closer to Mount Vesuvius, Pliny was there dictating notes to his secretary on the deck of the ship. And anyway, he eventually landed, but he shouldn't have. But it was the end of him. He died. Nobody knows whether he had a heart attack or whether he was overcome by fumes from the volcano. But anyway, that was the end of him. But this gave me an insight, a thought into, well, okay, what sort of a man was Luke? Luke was a physician. He was a doctor. How was a doctor trained in the ancient world? Well, Hippocrates, is that his name? Yeah, Hippocrates. He was they call him the founder of modern medicine. And his idea was sickness is not caused by the gods, sickness is caused by natural causes. So how do you deal with it? Well, you observe it, you interview the patient, and you take notes, and as you get more and more experience, you learn different conditions and how to treat them and so on. So I'm thinking, of course, you didn't go to university to learn to be a doctor. You found another doctor and you did an apprenticeship under him. But Luke would have been taught to interview people, he would have been taught to be a careful observer, and he would have been taught to be a note taker. So I think, just like Pliny, Luke was taking notes all through that voyage, and, well, hardly in the shipwreck, but he no doubt wrote a full account of it when he got onto the shore in Malta. And that explains a lot of things. All right, where am I up to? I've got out of, I've talked about that. So now I get to Luke's themes. The big, what I call the holy grail of Lucan scholarship, the thing that scholars of Luke are all looking for, or scholars of Acts, is the purpose. What was the purpose of this writing? Why did Luke decide to write these things in these ways at this time? What was going on around him? So that's a question we ask of every book in the Bible, of course. And there have been so many suggestions and so many PhD theses written on what was the purpose of Luke Acts that you'd never have time to read them all. But usually what happens is a scholar will notice something curious in the writing. So, for example, in the book of Acts, one scholar will notice that when Luke is talking about Roman officials, he's generally very polite and appreciative of what the Romans did to protect Paul. And he thinks, well then the purpose of Acts is to demonstrate that the Romans are okay. But then another scholar will come along and he says, oh yes, well that explains something, but it doesn't explain all these other things. And so you get these many purposes. Well, it seems to me that if we're trying to find out what Luke's purpose was, the first thing we've really got to ask ourselves is what was his major theme? What's he teaching about? What's the main thing he's teaching about? And maybe there's more than one thing. And so if we can identify his major theme and then his other themes and take these all together and look at them, well, they may give us a clue as to what was bugging him. Now, the major theme of the Gospel of Luke is the question, who is Jesus? If you read the Gospel of Luke, it's the same in Mark and the same in Matthew. You read the Gospel from end to end and you think, well, the biggest thing the Gospel writer's trying to show us is just tell us who Jesus is. But of course, they also are trying to do something else. They're trying to show us what Jesus was like, what he was like as a man. So the question of Jesus' identity and the question of Jesus' character are the two, I think, major themes in Luke's Gospel, as in the other Gospels. Well, what about Acts? Well, if you read through Acts, there's a very curious thing about Acts, and that is the number of speeches. Luke is telling a story, but it's punctuated with speeches. What's the purpose of those speeches? Well, I think the purpose of those speeches is that you can imagine in the home of Theophilus and you're hearing the book of Acts read for the first time, and every 5 minutes or so, someone's preaching the gospel to you. You're hearing Peter preach the gospel at Pentecost, or you're hearing Peter preach the gospel at the beautiful gate, or you're hearing Stephen preaching to his accusers, or you're hearing Paul preaching the gospel in the city in Antioch, or in Athens at the Areopagus. So it seemed to me when I kind of read these that I think, oh gosh, this guy's trying to rub my face in the gospel. That's what's going on here. So whatever his other purposes may have been, it seemed to me that his number one purpose is really just to preach the gospel. That's the major theme. He's doing that in Luke and he's doing that in Acts. And of course, along with that, he's showing us Jesus so we can be saved. So particularly in Acts, he's also telling us how we can be saved. Well, what are his other big themes? If you look at, who is Jesus? That's the big one. Salvation and the kingdom of God. I would put that as the second big theme, or maybe those first two are a bit like an ellipse. They're the two major themes of the work. But then there's the question of discipleship. How do you become a disciple? How do you remain a disciple? What is a disciple? Those things are big in Luke. And so that's obviously a theme in the gospel. Right. I've gone back, have I? Hang on, what's going on here? There. Now, if you're familiar with the Gospel of Luke, you'll know that almost half of the Gospel, from chapter 10 to chapter 19, is a great big collection of Jesus' teaching. Mostly it's just a collection of Jesus' teaching. So it's very obvious that when Luke set out to write, he wanted people to know what Jesus taught. Now, Mark does too. Mark tells us a little bit about what Jesus taught, but you can just imagine that Luke was a kind of pastor, maybe in Philippi, and he's got the Old Testament, and he's got Mark's Gospel, or something like Mark's Gospel. And that's his material for pastoring the church. People hearing Mark's Gospel read to them, well, they'd ask questions, wouldn't they? They'd say, but how was Jesus born? Or tell us more about Jesus' resurrection. Or what did Jesus teach about this? What did Jesus teach about that? And Luke must have really felt that. So when he went to Palestine, had the opportunity to collect more material, well, that's the sort of material that he collected. So you've got 10 chapters there of Jesus' teaching. So the Christian life, I've called that. And then a big interest of Luke is, of course, the scriptures, mainly thinking about the Old Testament scriptures. And then when you get to the book of Acts, well, he's also got who is Jesus as a continuing theme, salvation and the kingdom of God, but very little about discipleship, very little about the Christian life. He does have a bit about persecution and people standing up under persecution, which of course has to do with discipleship. But he has a lot to say about the church in the early chapters of Acts. And then the Gentile mission and the question of circumcision and Jews eating with non-Jews, those kind of things. He's very concerned about that. And then, of course, a big part of Acts is just focused on Paul and his story. So those seem to me to be the big themes. And we were working on this in one of our seminars across the road. Was it? No, it was just here. And I was saying, well, look, his purpose has got to be evangelistic. He's just preaching the gospel so often. And I gave a paper on this in Stellenbosch, but there's a chap called Robert Maddox who's written a book called The Purpose of Luke Acts, and he says, no, it's not evangelistic because there's too much material about Paul and about Paul's trials and that sort of stuff at the end of the book of Acts. He says that rules out an evangelistic purpose. Well, I don't think it does rule out an evangelistic purpose, because if you're preaching the gospel in the first century, one of the biggest problems you run into, particularly with Jews, is that they regard Paul as a heretic. They regard Paul as an enemy of Judaism. So you've got to do some apologetics if you want to preach the gospel. You've got to show that Paul is God's servant, and that's what Luke is trying to do. But there was one passage that we really couldn't fit in to this idea that Luke and Acts was evangelistic writing, and that's Acts 20 that I was preaching to you about yesterday, where Paul is addressing pastors. And Luke is recording that clearly because he's interested in pastors, and he wants to speak to pastors. And somebody in the seminar suggested that we, instead of seeing that passage as the kind of the bit that didn't fit in what we were doing, that we took that passage and sort of put that in the centre and to see whether there wasn't a clue to Luke's purpose there. And so somebody said, well, could it be that Luke's purpose was to write to pastors an account of Jesus and an account of the early church that they could use in their ministry. Now, when we thought about that, all these other themes fitted in. Because, of course, going back again to Theophilus, I don't know whether Theophilus was a pastor or not, but let's pretend that he was for the moment. Well, how is he going to preach the gospel? Well, lots of reasons, lots of ways, of course, but one way to preach the gospel is just to invite as many people into your house as you can and let them hear the story. So, yes, if you're writing a kind of a manual for pastors to use in their ministry, well, you're going to have a lot of evangelistic material. You're going to want to tell people how to become a Christian. You want to talk to them about discipleship. You want to talk to them about the Christian life. And of course, if there's Jews around, you need to justify the church. You need to show them that the church is part of God's plan. It's not just an upstart institution that's just started, Judaism, we've been here for 2,000 years. Why do you Christians start talking about this new group, the church? Right. Okay, well, we can end there, I think. That's probably good enough. Close.
I didn't mean to end it just like that.
Why not?
David, thank you very, very much. It's his birthday